This is The Process Shot. I'm Michael, I'm stuck in a haunted movie theater, and I've got another list coming your way to close out the year. It's all about the worst movies that came out in 2021. Yes, these are films that you put yourself through for 2 hours or so, then question several things, including their production choices, your very existence, and whether or not cinema should still be classified as an art, if these are allowed to exist. I suppose things could be worse, but I don't want to jinx myself. Anyways, I'm going to be working up from the movies I didn't really like to the movies that shouldn't really count as movies. Full disclaimer, this is based entirely on whatever I've seen while I've been stuck here, and while there may be other movies worth listing, I'm not the one who controls what gets screened around here. And without further ado, let's go. I just want to go over some honorable mentions first. These movies were bad enough to make it into my notes for the list, but not bad enough to actually be on the list. Consider them the lucky ones. First one here is America, the Motion Picture, directed by Matt Thompson. It may be a seminal example of modern adult animated comedy with a satirical edge, but it aims for the lowest common denominator of humor, and rarely, if ever, tries for anything smart. Next honorable mention is Jungle Cruise from Jaume Collet-Serra. This action-adventure follows a bit too close to the usual formulas for my taste, nor does it offer any strong character or story development, but at the very least its special effects work and environmental design make it tolerable. Dear Evan Hansen by Chbosky also managed to avoid the main list, though it's still bad enough to make it here. At the very least, it's one of the better entries in this entire list, with its drawbacks mainly stemming from the discomforting story and its structure, as well as the miscasting of the lead role. Everybody's Talking About Jamie, directed by Jonathan Butterell, is somehow a worse musical film than Dear Evan Hansen, though at least it's not the worst musical of the year. It probably helps that this movie's downsides are less in its casting and more in its lack of a story direction and integration of musical numbers, which probably could have been cut and you'd have missed nothing. Finally, He's All That, directed by Mark Waters. It's the last of the honorable mentions, though that's not saying too much. The movie is an unnecessary remake that tries to appeal to a demographic its writers don't seem to understand, hinging everything on its cast, modern pop culture references, and product placement, while taking its source story and playing it completely straight instead of trying to expand upon it. The only redeeming factor here is in its leads, who managed to give convincing performances against all other odds, elevating the film to, Disney Channel original movie levels of bad. And now on to the main list, starting with number 10 and Simon McQuoid's Mortal Kombat. Everything about this movie is forgettable, from its story to its cast and characters, and seems to have only been made for the sake of either setting up a film franchise or emulating the kills found in the actual Mortal Kombat games. Either way, the movie takes too long to get to the latter, forcing you to sit through the antics of an original character instead of anybody you'd actually recognize or like. At number 9, we've got Tom and Jerry, directed by Tim Story, which does give us likable, recognizable characters, and then sets them aside in favor of a story based more around giving the human cast easy money for a week or two of work. While the special effects are nifty, they're still burdened by the rest of the film being uninteresting, to the point that you'd much rather keep an eye on the background than the actual cast. Number 8 is Space Jam: A New Legacy, from Malcolm D. Lee, another movie based on a previously established franchise from Warner Brothers, which probably says more about them than they want to let on. This is also an unnecessary sequel that treads upon old ground with a next-generation vibe, seemingly all for the purpose of the company to flex the many IPs that it has under its belt, yet refuses to exploit, though that's probably for the better. In 7th, we've got Army of the Dead by Zack Snyder, which wastes all its potential in the opening 10 minutes before falling back on action movie standards with an additional dash of unnecessary tragedy, seemingly for the sake of breaking from standard action and zombie movie tropes. Despite its insistence upon this idea, it never manages to break that sort of ground, and what promise there is in the concept ends up going by the wayside. 6th place goes to Cinderella by Kay Cannon, a jukebox musical that wants to be self-aware and contemporary and succeeds, though it has to ramp things up to an annoying level to do so. Not to mention that it ends up sticking closer to the original story than it wants to pretend. Then again, the new story isn't all that impressive either, nor is anything outside of the music, though even so, you'd think that they'd have wanted to put in as much original work as they could, rather than just end up being cinematic karaoke. Number 5 is Rawson Marshall Thurber's Red Notice, which relies almost entirely upon the premise of 3 A-list talents doing their thing in order to justify the movie's creation, with the audience being the poor souls who have to deal with the fallout. Red Notice manages to say a whole lot of nothing while flaunting off a high amount of budget, trying to hide its flaws by showing off a bunch of fancy settings, stunt work, and a few nice outfits, though it all comes out as one major flex in the end. It's pretty clearly trying to be a big-budget action franchise, but it focuses more on who they have in their big-budget movie than on setting the movie itself apart from anything else, unless you want to count watching the movie all the way to the credits and realize there's nothing worth remembering about it. Coming in 4th, we've got Chaos Walking from Doug Liman, which has an interesting science fiction premise that goes wasted in favor of a formulaic storyline, falling back on tropes and cliches instead of, trying anything more creative. Granted, tropes and cliches aren't necessarily a marker of bad quality in itself, but it depends on how they're used and if their use is hidden well enough, which this movie fails to accomplish in its boring and by-the-numbers approach to its story, characters, plot progression, and just about everything actually seen on screen. It feels like another movie that wants to ride on the coattails of its lead players, but their seeming lack of energy and motivation, much less their on-screen chemistry, makes everything that occurs a complete chore to get through. Pretty much everything about the film's design seems made to repel any long-term interest in whatever's going on, outside of these special effects, which only just show how much potential in the concept is being wasted. 3rd place is reserved for Things Heard and Seen, directed by Shari Berman and Robert Pulcini. It's a film that tries its hardest to balance supernatural horror with modern theming and bring it into something to be considered elevated, but hardly tries to deliver any good amount of the former, and has the subtlety of roadkill when it comes to the latter. Much of the movie is bogged by a slow amount of world building and setup, with a payoff that comes all too late to be seen as anything significant, and the very ending of the film feels more like a cop-out made at the last minute because the film's budget ran out entirely. Little, if anything, about the movie is worth salvaging, much less worth talking about, and any highlights to be found are straight up canceled out by, whatever probably happens immediately afterwards. The second worst movie I've seen all year is Ben Falcone's Thunder Force, a superhero action comedy that has little action and less comedy, though at this point in the list that should be pretty obvious. It's also more focused on building up the world of the story rather than the story itself, but with an added bonus of seeming to completely ignore the idea of building up the story outside of hitting the traditional beats, and leaving it up to the cast to pad out the runtime with redundant improv and pop culture references. Everything of interest within Thunder Force has already been done by a better movie, and anything of importance is pretty much ignored up until it's necessary to pretend there's a story worth sharing. The only sign of any competence is that the movie looks like a movie, though even so, there's plenty to suggest that all the budget went into paying the leads, from drab and bland set pieces to crowds made up of dozens of extras. And now, the absolute worst movie I've seen all year. It might be obscure, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's The Pizza Joint, directed by William Molina, a film that is enough to make you step back and swear off movies entirely, if not voluntarily live as a deaf and blind person to avoid the risk of having to endure it again. Just about every other movie on the list has some sense of a silver lining or a show of effort, but The Pizza Joint lacks anything of the sort. The story is non-existent, the plot is all over the place, the characters are either undeveloped or unlikable, or both, and that's just in the actual content of the film. The movie is shot with the barest sense of technical ability, as if the filmmakers thought that turning a camera on and pressing record was enough to count as effort. Perhaps worse than that is the film's audio, which can range from being taken from the camera's onboard microphone to sounding like something that was recorded in a wind tunnel. If there's anything to say in the film's favor, it's probably that it shows that there's still a great desire within people to make the kind of movies that they want to see outside of high-budget productions and high-concept affairs, even if this is the kind of trash that they put out there in the end. And, well, that's the end of the list. That's also the end of the video, I suppose. If you like this list, leave it a like. If you think I've missed a movie that deserves to be here, or if I have a movie listed that you don't think should be here, leave a comment and let me know. As always, subscribe to the channel for more lists in the future. In the meantime, I'm gonna try and wash the stink of these movies out of my immediate memory. There's a reason people stop talking about them soon after their release, you know?